Hi, international mapping friends. I'm Maggie. I work as a GIS developer in an urban planning company in Paris, France. And today I wanted to introduce you to a major topic in urban planning, which is land artificialization. And please don't take a shot every time I say land artificialization during this presentation. Thank you. So first, we will try to define what is land artificialization. Then I will show you a simple method to map it. And finally, I will try to explain to you how the data that we've created can be used and interpreted. So, to begin with, what is land artificialization? It can be defined as the result of human action, which consists in transforming natural, agricultural, and forest soil due to construction of new housing and urban facilities and transport functions, can be housing activities, etc. And due to the construction of new housing and new activities on the outskirts of cities, the surface of artificial land is constantly increasing around the world. And nowadays, this phenomenon is considered as the primary cause of climate change, according to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, which is also known as the IPCC of biodiversity. So they say, I quote, "In terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, land use change from natural, agricultural, and forestry soil to urban is the factor that has had the most damaging relative direct impact on nature since the 70s. And in fact, land artificialization is a big phenomenon that contributes to soil sealing, first, which happens when the ground is covered by an impermeable material. But it also contributes to soil compaction, which is the decrease of soil porosity that also creates impermeable layers in the ground that restricts water and nutrient cycles. It contributes to soil erosion, which is the movement of materials on the surface of the earth. That can be problematic, yet traumatic for human beings as for any ecological system living on Earth. And finally, it participates to soil contamination. No need to give more details about that. But we have to acknowledge that land artificialization contributes also indirectly to other effects such as landslides and floods due to soil sealing and soil compaction, contributes to loss of biodiversity, contributes to loss of organic material in general, and contributes to the acidification of soils and oceans, and even more that I hadn't enough room to put it, but it reduces the capacity of agricultural land to feed us, basically. So, now that we know what land artificialization is and what its consequences are nowadays, we can try to map it, to see its spatial extent around the world, to measure it, and to see how it has evolved over time. The method I'll show you is repeatable on any GIS software and on R, I believe. And as an example, let's map land artificialization on the Arcachon Bay, which besides from being one of my favorite places on Earth, is also a good example of what I want to show you, like the specificities that need to be taken into account when mapping land artificialization. So here we are on the Arcachon Bay. As land artificialization is a consequence of urbanization, basically, we can use buildings and roads as a basis. They can be found on many servers depending on the country. We can use OpenStreetMap, for instance. So here is the same place on OpenStreetMap. Here are the buildings, and here are the roads. That's our basis. So by creating a buffer around those two elements, here there is a 65-feet buffer, we obtain a polygon, which gives us a first visual and spatial representation of the extent of land artificialization on the Arcachon Bay. It's just a first step, very simple, but gives us a first impression and therefore quantifies artificialization. But you could ask me, why do we even do a buffer? Why don't we just use the polygons of the buildings and the roads? Well, first of all, the roads here are just lines. And as a picture can show it, the artificialization doesn't really stop at the wall of the house. There is some soil sealing happening around. As for the sidewalk near the roads, I have a second example that was taken just a few blocks from where we are right now. And as we can see, this little space with some trees doesn't compensate all the loss of biodiversity and soil sealing implied around. So to me, and according to the definition I gave earlier, this has to be taken as artificialization. So here we are. But now that we have a basis, we can get to the fun part, which is the debates about what should be mapped as artificialization and what shouldn't be. Because as usual, every time someone draws a limit on a map, a frontier, someone else disagrees. So, to begin with, what about parks? What about urban parks? Well, even though they are permeable, for the most part, studies have shown that if an urban park is less than 2.4 acres, it doesn't compensate the loss of biodiversity, soil sealing, etc., etc. So maybe just the biggest parks should be taken away from the red polygon, but the smallest one should be considered as artificialization. On the contrary, what about graveyards? They are sealed for the most part, but they also participate in a way as a support of biodiversity, as also some urban studies have shown. So I leave here the question. What about electric poles? Should they be taken as artificial land or not? It probably depends on if they have an underground infrastructure or not. And even trickier, what about wilderness? It probably depends on if there's pollution on the ground or not, which can vary from one site to another, so it's still a question nowadays. The truth is, I don't have the answer to those questions, and they are very frequently asked in my full-time job. But if this method convinces you in a way, at some parts, and if it convinces your community, you will be able to use this data and interpret it in ways that leads me to my third point. Why do we even map land artificialization? Why do we ask ourselves all of those questions? Well, firstly, if you have data about the year of construction of the buildings and eventually the roads, which is less common, you can map the surface of land artificialization at different times and then appreciate its evolution. So for instance, here we have still on the Artificial Bay the buildings that were built before the 20th century. And for the roads, I didn't have that information, so we will consider that the roads nearby those buildings were there at that time. And then creating that same buffer, we have the artificialization at that time. And then if we add underneath the buildings that were built after that till today, 2022, and the buffer, we can then appreciate how much it has grown. We can appreciate the urban sprawl on the Artificial Bay. We can then have a more minimalistic map of this, and with a photo underneath. I'm sorry for the lack of contrast on that picture. Though this kind of data is very useful at a local scale when you're analyzing one city. If you want to analyze this data at a bigger scale, like at the scale of France, for instance, I wouldn't recommend this method. You won't be able to see the evolution of the polygons during the years. Though I would recommend other methods, such as this map provided by the French government. Here we have the ratio of space consumed being the space recently artificialized. Here the space artificialized during 2011 and 2021. And the more red is the town, the more it has been artificialized recently. And we can see, for instance, that Paris, here in the middle, is pretty white because it's already artificialized everywhere. Whereas on the Mediterranean coast and Brittany, there is a lot of tourism and a lot of artificialization going on. Even more interesting, we can compare the artificialization with population. And here we have the evolution of households compared to the surface consumed by housing. The more red is, when the map is red, it means that the population is decreasing, but the artificialization is increasing, whereas the greenier it gets, it means that there's more population growth than urban sprawl. And we can interpret this map by saying that in the Alps, such as in Brittany again, urban sprawl is way stronger than population, and this is again due to tourism, and a lot of second homes are built in those regions. So we'll conclude that's the most impressive map I will show you today. And I want to conclude by saying that this mapping method and this representation and quantification of land artificialization has shown that in France, artificialization is increasing 4 times faster than the population, which has a direct repercussion on the quality of life of the citizens, but also on the environment, as I've shown you. So to me, I think it should be a major subject that not only urban planners, but scientists in general should work on to have richer information, spatial information, and maybe change the way we build cities nowadays, before it's too late. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Maggie? Okay, I have a question. Thank you, by the way. So I know that you're an urban planner. Your job is not to necessarily go into local politics, but how do you envision a role for your firm in getting this to who can stop this? Is it at the local level?
Well, I'll talk about France because that's where I know the laws. Actually, in a few years, we will not be able to build on non-artificialized land unless you have a special right to do it. That's why it's a big issue nowadays. That's why there's so much debate. And I think it's before 2050, we won't be able to build on natural land. We'll have to densify our cities. I don't know if I've heard there are some equivalent rules that are decided here in the US, but I don't know much.
Some cities have enforced green spaces where you can't develop, such as Boulder, Colorado, near me. But of course, that drives up housing prices, and so you end up having, some externalities associated with that. But I know it's not perfect. Any other questions?
Yeah.
So I'm curious. You kind of left off on the. So some people think cemeteries are artificialization, and some aren't, and that's just a whole thing. So I'm curious, kind of how that gets moderated, because in your final maps you did have all that as being artificial land, but that seems to me like kind of a scale question of like, there might be permeability or some of these other things that get built into this larger area.
In France, they have decided that if a surface, even if it's not artificialized, if it's not sea, soil, etc., but there is a human activity on it, then it's artificialized. For instance, a golf court is considered artificialization, which probably is due to some politics decisions behind, but as a human activity happens on it, it's a business even, well, it's considered as artificialization. And cemeteries are considered artificialized as well. No, agriculture is, what is not artificialization is natural, agricultural, and forest. But the infrastructures implied around agricultural are artificialization, like where they, I don't have the words, you get me? Yeah, and to conclude, I just have to say that I have an Instagram page that talks about urbanization in a more funny way, more light way, and artistic, if you want to check it out. Thank you.